Okay, so to start, once again, I want to talk about stereotypes, and we should think about those as a set of beliefs about the attributes shared by a group of people. So the different types of traits you ascribe to a particular group. And again, these might be about anything: a racial group, an ethnic group, a religion, where somebody lives in town, if they, play soccer, if they, eat at a particular restaurant. These can be very flexible sorts of ideas. Um, if we think back to almost 100 years ago, a prominent social scientist of that era came up with a pretty parsimonious definition of stereotypes. They're the pictures in our heads. They are kind of the prototypes that come to mind for you when you think about a particular group. So if someone says woman or Asian person to you, there probably is an idea, a picture that pops to mind for you very quickly. Now, whether that idea is accurate or useful is a totally different question. But just like with any schema, it becomes activated, upon hearing about it. So, what are these pictures that come to mind for us? We've talked about schemas before. We have, you know, talked about these sense our social cognition unit. These are how we organize information in our mind. There are cognitive networks of associative information. And we get these schemas from lots of different places, from personal experiences, maybe in our modern world more often from media or culture or what we hear from other people. But there tends to be a lot of shared content between these stereotypes. Most people's stereotypes are not idiosyncratic. What I think about a particular racial or ethnic group, even if I don't necessarily believe it, like the ideas that I have heard about them are relatively similar to the ones that any of you or other people generally have heard. So to think about stereotypes as schemas, why don't we look at this as an associative network? Let's just have some kind of hypothetical group A, and there might be certain traits that we identify with group A. Maybe we believe that members of group A are deceitful, intelligent, and intimidating, first and foremost. So when you hear the phrase group A, these might be the things that come to mind for you very quickly and easily. But like with anything else, there might be things that are more distally related to your ideas about Group A. Maybe you also have the idea that members of Group A are funny, hardworking, and violent. But these are traits that you hold maybe a little less closely. The associations are less strong. So, like any other type of schema, they can have these levels of complexity, these different strengths of association between different sorts of concepts. So, when I say any of these things, lawyer, professor, athlete, college student, pothead, feminist, politician, there are things that come to mind for you very quickly. And that is going to involve those different sorts of traits, some of which come relatively easily, some of which, you might need to think about and try more deliberatively to call to mind. These things are reflected in kind of unexpected places too. One kind of methodological breakthrough in the last 8 or 10 years has been the realization that we can use Google Trends data in order to kind of get at some underlying beliefs in a lot of ways about different groups. And this isn't exactly the same. Google Trends data tends to be like breaking down the proportion of searches in a particular area to get at something about their beliefs. We'll get to that a little more later. But if you just type things into Google, you can find things related to people's stereotypes a lot of times. This is in some weighted fashion, according to your search history, this is giving you some kind of reflection of what people like you or people near you tend to search about a particular group. So these sentences that get finished when you put them into Google might give you some idea of some of the maybe undesirable thoughts that people have about different groups. So just another way that stereotypes are kind of reflected in our behaviors in our everyday lives. So how do we use these stereotypes? Basically, we have these ideas about different groups, but when we encounter an individual person, how do we actually apply those stereotypes to those people? And the answer lies in our ability to categorize things. In your everyday life, when you are categorizing things, most of the time that is a very straightforward and useful thing that you're doing. You're walking down the street and you are categorizing things as house, street, car, cloud. You have to be able to do this and put things into their neat little boxes in your head very quickly and easily so you can navigate your world. And your social world is no different. We try to reduce the amount of information by putting things into neat little boxes. And when we do this with respect to people in our contemporary world, we tend to do this along three specific dimensions. We categorize people according to race, gender, and age. We're very, very good at that. Even though, race is a social construct that we've invented, there's not a biological basis necessarily to different races. It's more of an idea that we have. It's been a pervasive enough idea that we are very quick at categorizing people, even along that dimension that doesn't really have a biological basis. But some things, of course, fit into a box a little more neatly than others. Think about if you are trying to, categorize different vehicles you see on the street. It's very easy sometimes to categorize things as like van, truck, sedan. But think about, when SUVs didn't really exist yet. The first SUVs that came out, people looked at those and weren't really quite sure whether they should put them into the car or van or even truck category. We had to come up with a category for these things and become better at sorting things into those categories. So the better something fits into a category, like if their skin color matches what we think about a particular group, or if they have things that clearly denote things like gender or age to us, then that's going to make it easier to categorize them, and we'll do it faster. It's important to remember that this overall is an automatic process. You're not sitting around thinking like, is that a man? Is that a child? Unless there are very ambiguous and conflicting cues, this is something that happens automatically. You don't have to think to do it. It just happens in your brain. Trish Devine is a researcher that I mentioned briefly in an earlier unit, but she really came up with some good early evidence about how this process works, especially with respect to race. So Devine had 3 studies that really told us some important stuff about how we activate and apply stereotypes. One of the important things that she found was that, just because you are aware of a stereotype doesn't necessarily mean you endorse it. And generally, we all have, like I said previously, the same sorts of information available to us. The stereotype about women or gay people or black people or Republicans. When I say those things, similar sets of traits are being activated in all of our minds. That does not mean you endorse them, or it does not mean you always would act on them in that way. But the content is culturally shared. We have a general shared understanding of what sorts of traits others expect those groups to have. Again, you might not endorse it, but it's not as though you're unaware of the stereotypes, even negative stereotypes about different groups of people. So she demonstrated this by giving them a racism scale, and she found that people who scored high versus low on that scale didn't differ in the awareness they had about these stereotypes. Everybody had this awareness. She also found that the stereotypes for everyone are spontaneously activated. Once you see a member of a group, particularly if it's someone that falls clearly into a group, you automatically categorize people and activate that knowledge. So people's ideas, for example, about what African Americans are like, or what the general culture believes African Americans are like, came to mind spontaneously for everyone, whether they were high or low on the racism scale that she came up with, or that she used. She didn't invent modern racism scale. But the important thing that she found is that just we know about these things and they come to mind automatically, but it is possible with some deliberation, some attention, some effort to inhibit applying these stereotypes to people and acting on them. So when you are making a judgment about someone or trying to determine how you're going to behave towards someone, if you are lower in prejudice and you have a desire or a motivation not to act on prejudice, sometimes you can inhibit that sort of application of stereotypes to people. Again, this falls back to our ideas about motivation and ability from dual process models, right? Unless you have the desire to be more fair and egalitarian, and you have the ability, like you're not stressed, you're not tired, you're paying attention, unless you have those things, then you're generally going to just let the stereotypes guide your behavior. But as Divine showed, and other people have shown many times since, um, if you just because we have this information and activate it doesn't always mean it's going to be applied to people. And this, is important from other things we've talked about too in social perception, where we talked about Hilda. Remember, there was this study where they told people they were going to be working with an older woman. They showed them a picture, and they gave them information that was either consistent with the stereotype of an older adult or not. And they manipulated people's motivation by whether or not they were getting rewarded based on their communal performance with Hilda and their ability, whether they were cognitively busy or not. And they found that participants remembered stereotype consistent information. Everyone remembered that stuff because everyone's schema for elderly people was activated upon seeing Hilda. But when the people were motivated and able to think more deeply and individuate Hilda from that stereotype they brought to mind, they remembered more of the information, the stereotype inconsistent information. We also have a tendency to think about groups generally that we do not belong to as being homogenous or all the same. You think about elderly people, most of you are on the young side, obviously. You probably have a kind of monolithic view of what elderly people are like, although elderly people are likely just as varied and as young people are in their different traits and interests, activities, and things like that. So the outgroup homogeneity bias has to do with this idea, all members of group X are so Y. We tend to treat people very similar when they belong to outgroups, although because we have more exposure with our own groups, we tend to think, I might think like white male professors are a very rich and varied group of people, right? Because it's a group that I belong to and I have maybe more exposure, and maybe I also am, trying to prop up my identity, right? Think that the group that I belong to is useful and interesting and not just some monolith. So if you know something about one member of a group that you don't belong to, you tend to think that that probably applies to other people of that group too. You don't really think hard about this most of the time. You just allow that categorization to happen. Two concepts that I really just quickly want to mention. These are, a little complex, so I don't want to spend too much time on them. But this outgroup homogeneity bias comes in part from two related concepts: entitivity and essentialism. Entitivity is the idea that social categories are coherent and discrete entities. And I talked earlier about how race, is like a social construction. It's not like there is a biological basis for someone being black versus white. So there's no genetic basis for that. It's just how we interpret skin color and put people into different groups. So we have this entitive sort of idea about white people and black people, that they are coherent groups that you can separate. There's some fine line that you can separate different groups in. And, that's a perception that we have, but it's not really true. So the more entitive you think groups are, the more likely you're able to think that they're kind of a homogeneous sort of monolith. Essentialism is kind of related to this as well, because we tend to think that those social categories have particular essences, for lack of a better synonym. That there are traits that make someone white, or make someone black, or make someone a woman. That if you don't share some of those traits, then you don't really fit neatly into that group. Maybe you're not really a woman, or really a white man, or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so in the next video, I'm going to move on to talk about how we apply these stereotypes a little